At 6:45 a.m. on November 2, 1943, Major Raymond Wilkins guided a small group of 8 B-25s toward Rabaul. Japanese radar picked them up almost immediately. He was only 26, flying his 87th combat mission, and the last original pilot still alive from the Third Bombardment Group. Below him waited a fortress, 367 anti-aircraft guns, and close to 400 enemy fighters guarding the most heavily defended stronghold in the entire Pacific War. The earlier briefing had been somber. Crews with tired faces listened as intelligence officers laid out the target. Simpson Harbor was packed with Japanese cruisers and destroyers supporting operations around Bougainville. Marines had gone ashore just 2 days before. If those ships broke out of the harbor, the whole offensive could collapse. 5th Air Force needed them crippled before that happened. The briefing concluded with a blunt warning. Some of the men in that room would not return. Wilkins didn't need the reminder. He knew the casualty numbers better than anybody. Before the day was over, 45 men would be dead or missing. Over nearly 2 years, he had watched every friend from his original group vanish. Some burned over New Guinea, others ditched in the Coral Sea, and several simply never came back from long-range missions. When he first arrived in February 1942, he'd flown in with dozens of crews. Now he was the only one left still flying combat. Ahead of him, 8 modified B-25 Mitchells followed in tight formation. These aircraft had been reworked with heavy forward-firing guns to tackle one of the hardest missions in the theater. The plan was brutally straightforward. Come in just above the water at mast height, skim bombs across the surface into ship hulls, saturate decks with .50 caliber fire, and escape before the inevitable swarm of fighters descended. Intelligence estimated nearly 200 Japanese fighters stationed around Rabaul's network of airfields. Even worse, 173 carrier aircraft had arrived the day before from the combined fleet. Pilots from Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuho were now operating from those bases. As the group crossed the Solomon Sea, Wilkins checked his gauges. Fuel was solid. Engines steady. His B-25, nicknamed Fifi, carried the full set of field modifications done at Eagle Farm in Brisbane. 4 .50 caliber guns were fixed into the nose, with another 4 mounted in pods along the fuselage sides. Altogether, the aircraft could unleash nearly 800 rounds every second. The technique had taken months of dangerous trial and error to perfect. Most of the men who helped develop it never lived long enough to see it mastered. The upgrades began early in 1943 after standard B-25s proved too vulnerable in low-altitude ship attacks. Crews needed overwhelming forward firepower to suppress enemy deck guns during their approach. Mechanics stripped out the bombardier stations and installed fixed gun arrays. In theory, the process was simple. Rake the target with gunfire, bounce the bombs into the ship side just below the waterline, then run at full power before enemy fighters could respond. In practice, early missions were disastrous. Aircraft were lost before even reaching their targets. Survivors learned to slip beneath radar, time their runs, and strike so quickly that Japanese gun crews barely had time to react. These hard-won lessons were paid for by the crews who never returned. Rabaul's radar now had a full half-hour of warning. Fighters were already scrambling from Lakunai, Vunakanaw, Rapopo, Tobara, and Borpop. Anti-aircraft gunners were manning the 367 gun positions encircling the harbor. Wilkins stayed locked on his altitude and heading as his men tucked in behind him. Rabaul was often called the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific. Volcanoes ringed a deep natural harbor capable of holding enormous numbers of ships. The Japanese had transformed it into their main regional stronghold, command centers in reinforced bunkers, radar stations providing constant warnings, and more anti-aircraft defenses than the combined totals of Darwin and Port Moresby. 5th Air Force intelligence considered it the most dangerous target they had ever faced. Wilkins had survived 86 missions because he followed procedures religiously. Check fuel every 10 minutes, monitor engine temperatures, keep the radio clear, and rely on your wingmen. Those simple habits had kept him alive since early 1942. But he also knew the grim truth. At some point, skill stopped mattering. Luck and statistics took over. No bomber crew had ever made it through what he was flying toward now. The coastline of New Britain finally came into view. Dark jungle spilling into vivid blue water. Wilkins dropped to 100 feet. Sea spray flecked his windshield. The formation tightened even further behind him. 7 other B-25s followed their commander into the mouth of the harbor, each carrying men who trusted his decisions completely. As they swept through the harbor entrance, Wilkins saw more targets than he had encountered in months. Cruisers, destroyers, and transports were packed into the anchorage. Then, at last, the first gun spoke. A heavy battery on the northern ridge fired a shell that burst 200 yards in front of them, leaving a black puff of smoke hanging in the air. More guns began firing almost immediately. Wilkins shoved the throttles forward and dropped to 70 feet. All 367 guns were now firing at 8 low-level aircraft streaming directly toward them. He stayed on course. His thumb hovered over the trigger. The first Japanese destroyer lay dead ahead, 600 yards out. In barely 90 seconds, the entire fight would be decided. At 500 yards, Wilkins opened fire. 8 50 caliber guns sent bright tracer lines ripping toward the destroyer. Brass casings clattered around the cockpit floor. His co-pilot prepared the bomb release. At 400 yards, the destroyer's deck erupted as the rounds ripped into gun mounts and crew positions. At 300 yards, Japanese gunners managed to return fire. Streams of 20mm shells from the destroyer mixed with heavier bursts from shore batteries. The sky between Wilkins and his target filled with tracer arcs and explosions. Rounds slammed into the B-25's wings and fuselage. The aircraft shook violently. Wilkins held the trigger until they were within 200 yards. The bombs dropped cleanly, 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs skimming across the water like skipping stones. He yanked the B-25 upward just as the first bomb struck the destroyer near the engine room. The second smashed into the center of the ship. Both detonated with massive force. The destroyer's hull tore open on impact, followed by violent secondary blasts as ammunition stores ignited. Wilkins had already passed overhead, climbing toward 200 feet while banking sharply left. Something felt off immediately. The B-25 wasn't responding the way it should. Controls were sluggish, delayed. A quick glance behind him revealed the problem. The vertical stabilizer had been shredded. Shrapnel had ripped through the tail section, and hydraulic fluid streamed out in thin, misty trails. The plane kept wanting to roll right, and Wilkins had to muscle the controls to keep it level. Meanwhile, the remaining 7 B-25s pushed forward with their own attacks. 2 more destroyers were hit, and a transport ship erupted in flames. But the moment of opportunity ended fast. Japanese fighters were now racing into the fight. Zeros from the carrier groups, fast and lethal at low altitude, closed in. Wilkins watched 1 B-25 vanish in a single blinding fireball after a Zero's cannon rounds tore into its fuel tanks. There were no chutes. The wreck plunged into the harbor at terrifying speed. The anti-aircraft fire only intensified. The Japanese knew the route the Americans would try to escape through, and gun crews shifted their fire with deadly precision. Shells began bursting in organized patterns. One more Mitchell took heavy hits, rolled upside down, and slammed into the water in a violent breakup. Wilkins checked his formation. Only 6 aircraft remained, counting his own battered bomber. His engines were still running, which was a small mercy. Number 1 looked stable. Number 2 was running a little hot, but not yet in the danger zone. Hydraulics were gone completely, meaning the landing gear would need to be cranked down by hand if they made it home. If the fuel tanks weren't punctured, that would be another miracle in their favor. A second ship appeared ahead through the smoke, a heavy cruiser. Larger, tougher, and carrying far more guns than the destroyers they had just attacked. The cruiser's anti-aircraft batteries were already spraying fire into the sky. Wilkins faced a brutal choice: break away and escape while he still could, or turn back in for another attack run. His formation was scattered, each aircraft fighting to stay alive on its own. The cruiser was turning, trying to line up its big guns on the retreating bombers. If someone didn't suppress those batteries, the remaining B-25s wouldn't stand a chance. Standard procedure said to leave. He had already struck 1 ship and, despite the damage, his aircraft was still airworthy. Get out now, survive the mission. That was how he'd made it through 87 combat flights. But the cruiser was locked onto his wingman. Wilkins glanced at his co-pilot, a young man on his 3rd mission, eyes wide and waiting for direction. Wilkins made his decision. He pushed the throttles forward and swung the damaged B-25 B-25 toward the cruiser. The co-pilot didn't need an explanation. They were out of bombs. This would be a pure strafing run, nothing but gunfire. The objective wasn't destruction. It was distraction. Draw the cruiser's attention away from the others and give them time to escape. At 800 yards, Wilkins dropped to 50 feet. With his tail nearly destroyed, keeping the aircraft steady was a battle in itself. He compensated with rough throttle adjustments and rudder kicks. Metal groaned in protest. At 600 yards, the cruiser's guns pivoted toward him. Every anti-aircraft mount on the ship unleashed fire simultaneously. 40mm cannons, 25mm guns, machine guns of multiple calibers. The sheer volume of rounds created a near-solid wall of tracers. Wilkins flew straight into it. At 500 yards, the windshield exploded. Shards of glass blasted through the cockpit. Something tore into his left arm, sending a jolt of burning pain through him. He kept firing regardless. 50 caliber guns hammered the cruiser's deck. At 400 yards, the B-25 felt like it was coming apart. Holes opened across the wings, and the number 2 engine coughed in protest. At 300 yards, the question wasn't whether the cruiser would hit him, it was whether his aircraft would remain intact long enough to complete the run. At 200 yards, he squeezed the trigger and held it. The barrage of 50 caliber fire ripped through the ship's superstructure. Gun crews ducked for cover or disappeared entirely as rounds shredded their positions. The cruiser's bridge took concentrated hits, windows blowing out and metal shearing away. At 100 yards, he let off the trigger and pulled back hard. The ruined stabilizer fought him the whole way. He used raw engine power to wrench the nose upward. The B-25 barely cleared the cruiser's mast, no more than 20 feet to spare. Smoke poured from number 2. Oil pressure plummeted. The cylinder head temperature needle was buried at the top of the gauge. But he had done exactly what he intended. Every gun on the cruiser had swung toward him during the run. Behind him, he counted 5 surviving B-25s climbing out of the harbor, free of the ship's fire. They were going to make it. The price came immediately. Number 2 engine seized and froze. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Wilkins feathered it and fought the controls again, flying single engine in a badly damaged bomber. He turned toward the harbor exit just as more danger appeared ahead. Japanese fighters were waiting. 3 Zeros swooped in from above, using high side passes with altitude and speed advantages. Wilkins had almost no ability to maneuver. His top turret gunner opened up, sending tracers climbing toward the incoming fighters. The formation split. 2 Zeros veered left. 1 dove straight down the center line, lining up on Wilkins. Cannon fire stitched across the fuselage. The radio operator's compartment took direct hits. Wilkins heard a scream through the intercom, then sudden silence. The Zero flashed past. The fighter roared past them. The gunner swore he'd scored hits, but the Zero kept going, looping up for another strike. More Japanese fighters were arriving. First a couple, then 4, then what felt like an entire swarm. The carrier groups had locked onto him now. 1 crippled bomber was easy hunting. Wilkins couldn't outrun them, and turning sharply was impossible. The 1 working engine was already pushed to the limit, and the battered airframe dragged through the air like it was flying with a parachute open. Speed dropped constantly no matter what he did. Another Zero slid in from the left. The waist gunner fired again, rounds sparking off the fighter's wing route, yet the Japanese pilot stayed locked on. A burst of 20mm cannon fire ripped into the B-25's left wing. Fuel sprayed from the torn tank in a long, shining sheet. The self-sealing system was supposed to prevent leaks. This time, it didn't. Raw fuel smeared across the wing, 1 tracer away from turning the bomber into an airborne torch. Wilkins eased the nose down. The descent gave him precious speed, but it also meant drifting closer to the anti-aircraft guns still lurking below. There was no good decision left. The harbor mouth was still 2 miles away, and Japanese fighters circled him like wolves. His gunners kept firing in short, desperate bursts, but the ammo belts were running thin. The coastline blurred underneath, thick jungle, sharp volcanic rock, still firmly under Japanese control. The Zeros kept hammering them, calmly and methodically. They knew he wasn't getting away. 1 pass shredded more of the rudder. Another claimed the left aileron entirely. The B-25 was barely holding together, more damaged metal than functioning aircraft, staying airborne through stubbornness and momentum. Wilkins glanced at the panel. Fuel pressure flickered on the remaining engine. Oil temperature spiked. The ruined wing pulled the plane sideways with uneven lift. He countered with rudder and throttle, each movement a battle. His wounded arm pulsed with pain, blood soaking deeper into his sleeve. His co-pilot tried to help where he could, but the controls needed both hands working in unison. Then, they crossed the coastline. Open ocean ahead. A sliver of hope. Maybe. The Zeros didn't back off. Another coordinated attack closed in, 3 fighters diving at once. The top turret gun fell silent, either out of ammo or its gunner no longer alive. The waist gunner kept firing, shorter bursts now, conserving what remained. More impacts shook the airframe. The lone engine coughed, sputtered, caught again, but Wilkins knew it wouldn't hold. The cockpit filled with the sharp smell of gasoline. Warning lights glowed across the instrument panel. Hydraulics gone. Electrical system failing. Oil pressure sinking. He had 2 options left: try to limp the 50 miles toward friendly lines, or ditch immediately while he still had some control. The engine answered for him. It quit without warning. Silence. Just wind and the buzzing of enemy fighters circling above. The B-25 began sinking through the air. Wilkins trimmed for the best possible glide, about 90 knots. Maybe 3 or 4 miles, if he was lucky. The Zeros kept firing. Either they didn't realize he was going down, or they intended to make sure there were no survivors. Cannon fire stitched across the fuselage again. Wilkins braced himself, called out to whoever was still alive on the intercom, telling them to prepare for ditching. Gear up, flaps up, hit the surface parallel to the swells. The co-pilot responded. The waist gunner didn't. Wilkins assumed he was gone. The sea rose fast beneath them, dark blue fading into green as they approached. Swells about 4 feet high. He lined up along them. For a plane missing half its tail and a shredded wing, the B-25 still glided surprisingly well. 500 feet. 300. 100. Would he survive the impact? Or would the Pacific claim the last member of his crew before rescue was even possible? They hit at 90 knots. The nose dug in hard. A wall of water slammed through the cockpit. Wilkins was thrown forward against his harness. The metal around him screeched as the fuselage twisted violently. The bomber whipped sideways and began to tear open. Icy water rushed in through the shattered windscreen, swallowing the cockpit in seconds. Wilkins unlatched his harness and tried to move. His left arm refused to respond. Far worse than he'd realized. His co-pilot struggled with his own straps, blood running from a deep cut above his eye. The bomber was going under fast, nose first, water already creeping over the instrument panel. Wilkins forced himself upward, reaching the overhead escape hatch. He yanked the handle. Nothing. The frame had warped in the crash. He tried again. His wounded arm screamed, useless. The co-pilot got free and moved to help. Together they pulled. Metal groaned but held. Water reached their chests, rising quickly. The tail was already submerged. The nose angled down sharply. They pulled one more time. Wilkins used his good arm and both legs to wrench with everything he had. The co-pilot braced against the seat. The hatch finally tore open. Water poured through even faster now. No time to waste. Wilkins shoved the co-pilot upward toward the opening. Wilkins made sure the kid got his chance. The co-pilot slipped through the hatch first, vanishing into open water. Wilkins reached for the frame next, trying to haul himself out, but his left arm was dead weight. He pushed with his legs and pulled with his good arm, dragging himself upward, until the crippled bomber suddenly pitched even steeper, nose diving. The jolt knocked him backward into the cockpit, straight into the rising water. Everything went dark. No air, no visibility, just cold seawater swallowing him whole. He felt around blindly until his hand brushed the hatch again. He kicked hard, lungs screaming for air, and forced himself upward. He broke the surface with a desperate gasp. The co-pilot was already 10 feet away, swimming and keeping his distance from the sinking aircraft. Behind them, The B-25's tail stuck out at a sharp angle, the last pocket of trapped air keeping it afloat. A few seconds later, even that disappeared, slipping under the waves with a trail of bubbles marking its grave. It was the final aircraft from the original Third Bombardment Group. Now gone. Wilkins tried to swim, but his left arm wouldn't respond at all. Blood drifted through the water around him. His wound had opened up badly, and the salt only made it burn worse. He kept kicking to stay above the surface while scanning for survivors. None. The radio operator and waist gunner had gone down trapped inside the bomber. Japanese Zeros circled overhead. One dipped low, making a pass as if lining up for a final strike. Wilkins braced for the inevitable burst of fire, but it never came. Instead, the pilot wagged his wings, a small gesture of respect, before the formation turned away and headed back toward Rabaul. Within moments, the sky was empty. Wilkins floated in silence. The co-pilot swam closer and asked if he was okay, but Wilkins couldn't answer. The blood loss was overtaking him fast. His vision dimmed, the world narrowing to a blur of sky and water. The co-pilot grabbed him, holding his head above the surface. 2 men, no raft, no rescue, 50 miles from friendly lines. Their strength wouldn't last. They made it about 40 minutes. Maybe less. Eventually, Wilkins' weight began pulling them both under. The kid had no choice, either let go or drown with him. He let go. Wilkins slipped beneath the surface and never came back up. 26 years old. 87 combat missions. One of the last original members from February 1942. The Pacific kept him. Weeks later, intelligence teams pieced together his final moments from scattered radio logs and eyewitness accounts. 2 enemy ships sunk, a heavy cruiser's guns knocked out at a critical time, and 5 B-25 saved because he drew fire away from them. Those numbers went into the official after-action reports. Wilkins died never knowing the full extent of what he accomplished. To him, he just did what needed to be done, protecting his squadron. That was enough. His Medal of Honor would be awarded after his death. His family in California accepted it. The young woman in Australia he hoped to marry learned he wasn't coming home. The co-pilot drifted alone for 3 days before a U.S. Navy patrol boat finally found him, burned by the sun, dehydrated, barely alive. He told everything he remembered: how Wilkins refused to break off after the first ship, how he turned back under fire to distract the cruiser, and how he stayed with the plane all the way into the ditching. His testimony went straight into the official records. Meanwhile, the battle over Rabaul continued. American bombers were still trying to fight their way out. 5 B-25s scattered in different directions, each one alone, each one hunted. More Japanese fighters swept in. The fight wasn't finished, not even close. Lives were still being decided in the sky. But something had shifted. The heavy cruiser Wilkins attacked had stopped firing. Its gun crews were too shaken and disorganized to resume immediately. That short pause, just a few minutes, was all the other bombers needed. Seconds bought by Wilkins turned into survival for others. 1 B-25 limped home on a single functioning engine after 3 others were shot out. Another absorbed 70-plus hits before managing a landing with no brakes or hydraulics, skidding off the runway but saving its crew. A third bomber ditched 20 miles offshore and was rescued by PT boats. Would any of Wilkins' squadron make it home to report what truly happened over Simpson Harbor? Or would November 2nd claim them all? By 10:30 a.m., 5 B-25s finally crossed into Allied airspace. 2 streamed smoke. One had half its tail missing. Another staggered along on one engine. The 5th looked whole until crews inspected it. More than 300 punctures and shrapnel holes scarred its skin. They landed at Dobadura, New Guinea. Ground crews rushed to the aircraft. Medics pulled wounded men from turrets and waist positions. 3 were dead. 7 injured. The rest were stunned into silence, shell-shocked after watching Wilkins go down and others explode midair. A few had glimpsed the co-pilot drifting in the water. None saw the major surface. Debriefings began immediately. The mission had a single purpose: keep Japanese ships pinned in Simpson Harbor so they couldn't threaten the Marines landing at Bougainville. Now the question was simple: how much had they accomplished, and at what cost? The crews gave their reports one by one, careful and precise. Wilkins had confirmed the first kill, a destroyer, struck cleanly and sent to the bottom. The second vessel, a heavy cruiser, was left crippled and burning, drifting helplessly. A third destroyer had been torn apart mid-harbor and was in the process of sinking. A fourth ship, a transport, burned fiercely at the dock as its ammunition stores went up in chain detonations. The debriefing officers wrote everything down, matching each account against the others until a clear picture formed. The losses were staggering. 8 B-25s had been shot down. 9 P-38 escorts were gone. 45 American airmen dead or unaccounted for, the bloodiest day the 5th Air Force had endured in that entire campaign. The numbers were brutal to look at. 11% of the attackers wiped out. Nearly a quarter of all bomber crews killed. And yet the mission did what it was supposed to do. Every Japanese ship stayed locked inside Simpson Harbor. Not a single one sailed to support the counterattack at Bougainville. The Marines secured their beachhead without facing a single enemy warship. Strategically, a win. Tactically, a slaughter. War boiled down to cold math: ships versus men, ground gained versus lives spent. But one crew's experience stood apart. Sergeant Dick Walker of the 13th Bombardment Squadron, part of the same group Wilkins served in, though not the same squadron, would come away with a story that exposed something darker about leadership under fire. Walker's unit approached Rabaul from a different direction, 8 B-25s flying in tight formation. Same mission. Same defenses. Same deadly harbor. As they neared the entrance, anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky and Japanese fighters scrambled. Their commander was supposed to lead them in. Instead, at the last moment, he peeled off, turned around, and headed back toward New Guinea. No attack run, no warning, no explanation. Just gone. 7 bombers behind him suddenly had no leader, and radio silence meant they couldn't ask why. They simply followed him away from the target. But Walker refused to accept that. He broke away alone. 1 B-25 against Simpson Harbor. Against hundreds of guns. Against hundreds of fighters. No wingman, no backup, only raw determination fueled by anger at watching his own commander flee. He dropped to mast height and picked a target, a large merchant ship, slow and exposed. He locked onto it and went straight in. The anti-aircraft fire was far worse than the briefing had suggested. Shells burst in deadly patterns around him. Tracers cut through the air like luminous threads. The hits came fast, wing, tail, fuselage, but Walker kept pushing forward. 500 yards. 400. 300. His guns tore into the ship's deck, shredding it under relentless fire. At 200 yards, he released his bombs in a perfect skip-bombing run. Both charges struck just below the waterline. The ship buckled and began to roll over. Walker yanked the B-25 upward just as a swarm of Zeros descended on him. 6, 8, maybe 10. He didn't bother counting. His gunners fired back until their ammo was nearly gone. The bomber was full of holes but still holding together. He threw the aircraft into violent maneuvers, doing anything he could to throw off the fighter's aim. Somehow, the B-25 absorbed the punishment and kept flying. Walker made it out by himself. 1 bomber. 1 destroyed ship. 1 man who refused to run. He landed at Dobadura about 90 minutes after Wilkins went down. Inspectors counted 43 holes in his aircraft. His crew had a few cuts and bruises, nothing life-threatening. They climbed out furious. Their commander had abandoned them and the mission. They confronted him that afternoon. Walker and several others demanded answers. They got excuses instead: weather, enemy strength, tactical flexibility. No one believed him. The operations officer backed the commander, trying to shield him. It was politics, not leadership. Headquarters eventually stepped in quietly. The commander and the operations officer were both reassigned to the States without fanfare or explanation. No court-martial. No public reprimand. They simply disappeared from the theater. New officers took their place. The whole incident went into restricted files and stayed buried for decades. Meanwhile, the fight over Rabaul raged on. The primary strike force included 72 B-25s, not just Wilkins' group and not just Walker's 8. Several formations hit the harbor at once, overwhelming the Japanese defenders with targets. There were too many Americans in the sky and not enough Japanese fighters to stop them all. Still, the cost kept rising. Another B-25 went down at 11:15 a.m. Another at 11:23. Above them, P-38 Lightnings tangled with Zeros at 12,000 feet. Two Lightnings blew apart. One Zero spiraled into the harbor below. The air battle churned on for an hour and a half. And the question hung over everything. Would the sacrifice of 45 American airmen be enough to ensure, cut point ends here, ready for the next part? The aftermath was clear within 2 days. Japanese naval forces at Rabaul hadn't moved. No ships had ventured toward Bougainville. The marine beachhead remained untouched. Reports flowed back to Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Truk. 7 vessels either sunk or severely damaged. Harbor defenses had been disrupted, and fighter strength was down. The carrier air groups had taken heavy losses, 18 Zeros destroyed, another 12 permanently out of action. The pilots, veterans from Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuho, were irreplaceable in 1943. Japan simply couldn't match the rate of losses with trained replacements, while American production churned on. Every downed pilot mattered. American intelligence intercepted Japanese communications. Translations revealed the full impact. November 2 ND's raid was deemed the most aggressive air assault Rabaul had ever faced. Low-level bombing had proven brutally effective. Ships at anchor were sitting ducks. Facilities were damaged. Morale shaken. The Japanese concluded that Rabaul could no longer serve as a secure base for major fleet operations. By November 10th, carrier air groups had been pulled back to Truk. The risk of losing more irreplaceable pilots outweighed the value of the port. Rabaul remained a fortress, but its offensive edge was broken. At Bougainville, the Marines expanded their perimeter, unchallenged by naval fire. No cruisers bombarded the beach. No destroyers threatened the supply lines. By mid-November, 3 divisions were ashore, bringing artillery, tanks, and crucial supplies. The invasion had succeeded. In cold numbers, 45 American airmen lost, 7 Japanese ships destroyed, a key base neutralized, and Bougainville secure. Calculations in official histories, numbers, statistics, and outcomes. But names mattered to the survivors. Wilkins, the radio operator lost in the ditching, the waist gunner who never surfaced, crews from other B-25s, P-38 pilots who never came home. Each had families, friends, a life waiting elsewhere. 5th Air Force immediately began analyzing Wilkins' actions. Multiple witnesses confirmed what he had done. 2 ships destroyed, the cruiser suppressed, the squadron protected during withdrawal. His decision to continue the attack, even with a crippled plane, and the final strafing run that drew enemy fire, all checked the criteria for the Medal of Honor. Conspicuous gallantry, risk above and beyond the call of duty, direct engagement with the enemy. Wilkins qualified on every count. His squadron commander submitted the recommendation on November 5, 3 days after the mission, with supporting statements from surviving crew members. The paperwork moved through the proper channels: Group, Wing, and then 5th Air Force Headquarters. General George Kenney, commander of all air operations in the Southwest Pacific, reviewed the case personally. Most Medal of Honor recommendations he saw were rejected. The bar was high, but the evidence for Wilkins was overwhelming. Kenney approved it on November 20th and forwarded it to Washington. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall signed off in December, and President Roosevelt gave final approval in January 1944. Major Raymond Wilkins was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His family in California received a telegram first, then an official letter. The medal came later, presented at a ceremony in California, accepted by his parents and younger brother. The girl in Australia he had planned to marry wasn't invited. She learned of his death indirectly, through a letter he had written 3 weeks before the mission. Plans for medical school, a life after the war, maybe Australia, maybe back in California. All the dreams in neat handwriting. None of them came true. The Pacific had other plans. The letter became a memorial, filed with photos and service records. The war moved on. 5th Air Force continued raids on Rabaul, November 5th, November 11th, each one smaller than the November 2nd assault. Defenses were reinforced, anti-aircraft guns added, radar improved, but the psychological impact had shifted. American crews knew Rabaul could be struck. ships could be sunk. The fortress wasn't invincible. Morale improved despite the losses. The November 2nd raid became legendary, the day the 5th Air Force proved it could take on the toughest target in the theater. Dick Walker survived, completed his tour, and would tell his story years later. The commander who abandoned his squadron, the solo attack, Wilkins going down fighting. His testimony verified what happened that day. New crews rotated in, inexperienced pilots who learned of Wilkins' bravery during training. The last man from the original Third Bombardment Group, the major who attacked alone with a shattered aircraft, the example they were to follow. The Third Bombardment Group received a distinguished unit citation for the November 2nd raid. Every man who participated, living or dead, was entitled to wear it. The citation documented their courage and sacrifice. On paper, the mission looked neat, professional. Target, opposition, results, casualties, everything clean and orderly in official language. But anyone who was there knew the reality had been chaos, smoke, fire, and sheer violence. Would Wilkins' sacrifice be remembered beyond citations and medals? Or would history reduce him to just another statistic in a long list of forgotten battles? The truth is, it took time, but the story endured. Wilkins' Medal of Honor citation became part of official records. Military historians included the Rabaul raids in Pacific War chronicles. November 2nd appeared in Air Force historical studies, sometimes only in footnotes, sometimes in long narratives. But the tactical lessons spread fast. Skip bombing became standard 5th Air Force doctrine by December 1943. Every B-25 squadron received training. Modifications Wilkins had flown, forward-firing machine guns, reinforced noses, enhanced cockpit armor, became standard on all production models. His aircraft became the template for hundreds more. The technique itself evolved. Crews refined angles, altitudes, and approaches. 50 feet above the water worked best. 40 feet was suicidal. The goal, low enough to stay under radar, high enough to keep windscreen spray from obscuring vision. Knowledge was passed down, paid for in blood. Rabaul remained a target into early 1944, but it had changed. The Japanese pulled out their heavy ships, leaving only destroyers, subs, and smaller craft. Major fleet units moved to truck, then farther back as the Americans advanced. Rabaul became isolated, cut off, and eventually irrelevant. The fortress that had cost 45 lives on November 2nd never fell to a direct assault. American strategy shifted. Why attack when you could contain and bypass? The Japanese garrison lingered until the war's end, supplied slowly by submarine, slowly starving. November 2nd had marked the start of that decline. The Third Bombardment Group continued missions until 1945. By mid-1944, none of the original crews remained, dead, rotated home, reassigned. Wilkins had been the last of that founding generation. Every subsequent crew was replacement. The B-25 Mitchell itself became one of the most produced bombers of the war. Nearly 10,000 built, used by every Allied nation. Adaptable, versatile, ground attack, anti-shipping, medium-altitude bombing, reconnaissance. Wilkins died in an early model. Later versions incorporated every lesson learned from missions like November 2nd. His family kept his memory private. No public speeches, no interviews. The Medal of Honor sat in a display case. Personal effects, letters, photographs, his uniform, were boxed and stored. His parents passed in the 1960s. His younger brother eventually donated the collection to the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Today, it's just one small case among hundreds. Wilkins Medal, a photograph, a brief description of the November 2nd mission. Most visitors walk past, unaware of the story behind it. Veterans of the Third Bombardment Group held reunions, toasting those who didn't come home. Wilkins was always remembered. Over the decades, the gatherings dwindled. Dick Walker attended several, recounting the commander who fled, Wilkins going down fighting, his own solo attack. Walker died in 1998, 76 years old, his obituary mentioning only a single line about wartime service. The co-pilot who survived the ditching with Wilkins never spoke publicly. He left the Air Force, became a teacher, married, raised children, and remained silent about what he'd witnessed until his death in 2003. The girl in Australia moved on, married, had a family, but she kept Wilkins' letters. The last one arrived in January 1944, weeks after his death. It was written October 28, just days before the mission. In it, Wilkins reflected on his luck running out. 86 missions flown. Everyone from his original group gone. The odds caught up to everyone eventually, but he wrote of duty, of the men depending on him, and of finishing the mission. He promised that after his 100th mission, he'd return, marry her, start the life they'd planned. Mission 88 would be his last. That promise died in the Pacific. Today, modern Air Force officers study the Rabaul raids in professional military education courses. Case studies focus on leadership, tactical innovation, acceptable losses versus mission accomplishment. Wilkins is held up as an example of commitment and sacrifice. The analysis is clinical, stripped of emotion. Yet behind every lesson are real lives, real courage. Would future generations understand what Wilkins and the 44 others gave at Simpson Harbor? Or would they be reduced to another statistic in a war that claimed millions? The numbers tell one side of the story. 7 Japanese ships destroyed or damaged, naval operations disrupted, the invasion of Bougainville protected. The human story, the bravery, the sacrifice, the loss, was far more than numbers could capture. Strategic objectives were achieved. 45 American airmen were lost. By military standards, the losses were acceptable. The mission succeeded. But numbers can never capture the human cost. Raymond Wilkins was just 26. He'd survived 86 missions. Most crews didn't even make it past 20. He had plans, a future outside of war, medical school, marriage, a life waiting after combat. All of that ended in the final seconds over Simpson Harbor, when he made the choice to turn back toward the cruiser. It wasn't a complicated decision. His squadron was already withdrawing. The cruiser was tracking them. Someone had to draw the fire. Wilkins could have flown on. Nobody would have blamed him. His aircraft was shredded, riddled with holes. The mission was done. Standard procedure dictated pulling out. Yet he turned back. Not because anyone ordered it. Not because doctrine demanded it. He did it because 5 B-25s, 5 crews full of men, were in danger and he could help. The math was simple. 1 aircraft, 1 crew, versus 5 B-25s and their crews. The calculation only made sense if you valued others more than yourself. That is what the Medal of Honor recognizes. Not just bravery under fire, not just completing the mission. That is expected. The medal honors the moment when someone chooses almost certain death to save others. When instinct to survive gives way to something bigger. Duty, brotherhood, sacrifice. Wilkins made that choice at 800 yards from a Japanese heavy cruiser. He pushed throttles forward on a dying aircraft, flew straight into concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and drew every gun away from his squadron. He saved lives he would never see. Men who returned home, raised families, lived decades he never would. His death bought their futures. The 5 B-25s he protected all made it back that day. Damaged, battered, scarred, but flying. 25 men survived because of him. Some flew more missions, some rotated home, but all carried Wilkins' story with them, through debriefings, letters, and training for new crews. One pilot even named his son Raymond. Another kept a photo of Wilkins in his logbook for 40 years. A third visited Wilkins' parents in California, explaining what happened over Rabaul in detail, the story the official telegram could never tell. The tactic Wilkins pioneered, skip bombing at masthead level, became doctrine. Thousands of missions later, ships across the Pacific from Rabaul to the Philippines, New Guinea to Okinawa, were sunk using the method he tested under fire. His aircraft, nicknamed Fifi, never flew again. It rests on the Pacific floor, 50 miles from Rabaul. Corroded by salt water, but it did its job, sunk 2 ships, saved a squadron. That's more than most bombers ever accomplished. The girl in Australia eventually forgave him for dying. Years passed. She understood duty, war, sacrifice, but emotionally, the loss was harder. Their shared future disappeared on November 2nd. She rebuilt a life, but never forgot the pilot who had promised to return. Wilkins' parents never recovered. Losing a child leaves a void nothing can fill. They attended ceremonies, proudly accepted the Medal of Honor, but it didn't replace their son. They carried that absence for 20 years. Those 87 missions Wilkins flew, 87 chances to die that he survived. Luck, skill, fate gave him another day each time. Mission 88 was different. Perhaps luck ran out. Perhaps fate caught up. Every combat pilot knows, you can't fly forever. Statistics guarantee it. Wilkins lasted longer than most. He understood it, even wrote about it in letters. Yet he kept flying because someone had to. That's the real story of Rabaul. Not the tactics, not the ships, not the strategic gains. It's about ordinary men doing extraordinary things because the mission demanded it, because friends needed them, because walking away wasn't an option. Major Raymond Harold Wilkins died doing exactly that. His B-25 sank 2 ships, saved his squadron, and then took him to the bottom of the Pacific. 26 years old. Medal of Honor recipient. Last man from the original Third Bombardment Group. A hero. If this story moved you like it moved us, do a small favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories of mechanics who turned wrenches into weapons. Pilots flying burning aircraft to save their crews. Men standing alone against impossible odds and winning. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, United States, UK, Canada, Australia. Our community stretches across the globe. You're not just a viewer, you're helping keep these memories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you've heard of Raymond Wilkins before today. Just say you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Major Wilkins does not disappear into silence. This man deserved to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.